Okay, welcome to our third class of Swedenborg 101. We've explored his biography and we've explored his theology. And this week we're going to explore his impact. And then our final class, which will be next week, will be on the Swedenborgian movement. But this week I want to focus on his impact, particularly in the arts, philosophy, psychology, politics, and let's let him in. And I know that in some of Swedenborg's own journal reflections, he laments that no one is paying attention to his writings. He's really, really disappointed about it. He was earning an international reputation as a scientist, and he was a member of the House of Nobles, as we learned in his biography. But when he moved toward theology, he was not getting the attention he thought he deserved. And some of his friends even wondered, maybe something happened to him when he got into this religious stuff. Some even thought maybe he had gone nuts because he was so well respected in science, and now all of his scientific work would be lost to history because of this religious experience, this mystical path he was on. So as it turns out later, well, hundreds of years later, as we'll see today, his theological writings did have a long-term impact. Though his drawing of the first airplane hangs in the Smithsonian as one of the first in the history of flying machines, it's his theological writings that have a huge impact. So what's interesting about his theological impact of his writings is they often don't really happen that much with theologians. It's much more with artists, poets, novelists, reformers, as we'll find out today. Now, one of the reasons might be I mentioned in his biography that there was some heresy trials for his work in Sweden. So that might put a chill on it among the religious types. But the cutting edge artists, the counterculture of Europe, particularly of England and then of New England, they really got into it. And when it translated from Latin to English, German, it really caught on among certain groups. So let me just talk about some of the groups that it caught on with. The first I would highlight is the Romantic movement, and that is where I think he really had his biggest impact. This movement of thought began about 12 years after his death, primarily in England, and it lasted from about 1790 to 1850. Swedenborg's evolutionary view of spirituality and his idea that the church had failed was very interesting to a lot of artists and thinkers. Also, his idea of pluralism, that all faith paths were good, was another thing very attractive to the Romantic writers, and the most famous being William Blake, who's pictured here. Romantics are known for their desire for individual liberty. They were reformers. They denounced the exploitation of the poor, mainly through the industrialization that they saw. And they stressed non-conformity and the conviction that people should follow their ideals rather than be imposed upon by conventions and rules. One of the most famous Romantics was William Blake, and he read Swedenborg very early in the 1780s. He was so drawn to Swedenborg's view of a divine love that entered into everything in the universe that it impacted his writing and his poetry. William Blake actually attended the first meeting ever of a Swedenborgian group, calling themselves the New Church, in 1789. But the formality and the doctrine and I'm sure the church gossip and the nature of organized groups, it turned him off. So he did not participate in the Swedenborgian community, but he was greatly impacted by it in some of his writings. Maybe his most famous poem is Tiger, Tiger, and it's often linked with Swedenborg's understanding of the spiritual life of humanity. Blake and his interest had an impact among other Romantic thinkers, writers, poets of England at that time. So in his circle, he had an impact because of his interest. You may also remember his poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, if you can recognize that, reflecting some ways a critique of Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell. In Blake's circle was John Flaxman, who was one of the great sculptors of his day. And he actually went in and formally joined a Swedenborg society. So you may have recognized some of his sculptures, but he said that his sculpting and art was impacted by his understanding of Swedenborg. The poet and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was inspired by Swedenborg, and he wrote, "I can venture to assert that as a moralist, Swedenborg is above all in praise, and that as a naturalist, psychologist, and theologian, he is strong, and his strong and varied claims on gratitude and admiration of the professional and philosophical land." So he really likes Swedenborg. The image here is a note, a thing that he wrote about abolitionists against slavery, too, and that was impacted by Swedenborg's view opposing slavery. Also impacted in that circle of sort of romantics, and this is outside of England, this is an Irish poet, William Butler Yeats, who won the Nobel Prize in his time, was also a reader of Swedenborg. He actually wrote a piece entitled Swedenborg, Mediums and Desolate Places, where he kind of lays out the impact Swedenborg had in his thoughts. It's a very interesting piece. So at the tail end of the Romantic period comes another period that was completely related to the Romantic period called the Transcendentalist period. You may have heard of the Transcendental movement. The locus for this was much more in New England in the United States, where the Romantic period was much more in England. And it got going primarily around, let's say, 1830 and lasted to around 1860. Like the Romantics, the Transcendentalists were anti-institution, particularly organized religion and political parties. They thought that these organizations were corrupting the purity of individuals, and that they believed that the best thing a person could be would be self-reliant and independent, and that the only true community that you could create was one where people were made up of truly non-conforming individuals. You'll recognize some of the most famous members of the movement being probably some of the most famous writers in American history, most notably Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson, it seems, did the same for Swedenborg among the Transcendentalists as Blake did among the English Romantics. He influenced the likes of Henry David Thoreau of Walden Pond fame, and he also impacted Margaret Fuller, an early feminist and journalist. Fuller was quoted as saying that she loved Swedenborg's view of women that were sufficiently large and noble within his framework. Emerson wrote a series about representative men, people who kind of represented the best in society. And he talked about Swedenborg and one of his representative men as the mystic. Other people that he included in his series were Plato, Shakespeare, Napoleon. And so in The Mystic, he describes Swedenborg as a colossal soul. He lies vast abroad on his times, uncomprehended by them, and he required a long focal distance to be seen. He said that the most remarkable religious history of the recent age was that of the genius Swedenborg, one of the mastodons of literature. He's not to be measured by whole colleges of ordinary scholars. And he goes on praising Swedenborg. So Swedenborg's systematic way of looking at the world was extremely attractive to him, and he really impacted his circle. Another in that circle, another famous American family of the Transcendental period was the James family. And there's Henry James, who was senior. He had two sons, Henry James Jr. and William James. Henry James was very impacted. And in the photograph here, that's Henry James Sr. with his son, Henry James Jr. And to the left is our professor, Devin Zuber, at the Swedenborg School. And that's the chest that Henry James Sr. of Swedenborg's books that he carried with him everywhere. James Sr. had a mystical experience that was life-transforming around his mental health that was through Swedenborg's writings, and he would then proselytize for Swedenborg the rest of his life. He also was a leader in the support for utopian communities among the Transcendentalists. His two famous sons, Henry Jr. and William, were also influenced by their father's engagement with Swedenborg. And his older son, William James, very famous in American history, wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. It's still read today as a breakthrough in understanding religious pluralism, and many believe it shows the impact of Swedenborg's embrace of all faith paths. And William James would go on to become the father of American psychology. In that same transcendental circle was a Japanese Zen teacher, D.T. Suzuki, who wrote Buddha of the North, and that is about Swedenborg. He would also translate Swedenborg into Japanese. He describes Swedenborg in these terms: revolutionary in theology, traveler of heaven and hell, champion of the spiritual world, king of the mystical realm, clairvoyant in history, a scholar of uncomparable vigor, scientist of a penetrating intellect, gentleman free of worldly taint. And he goes on and on about the importance of Swedenborg. So Suzuki was highly influenced and saw Swedenborg and very much aligned to Buddhist teachings. Another famous writer was Honre de Balzac, and he writes, in some of his books, he writes imaginary figures that are sort of taken from Swedenborg, like literally Swedenborg as a character in some of his books. He also wrote the book Seraphita, where he plays with the masculine and the feminine that he got from Swedenborg's book Conjugal Love. I did a sermon on transgender rights, and I referred to that book and Swedenborg's impact on the idea of the masculine and the feminine, if you want to check out that story of how the masculine and feminine play out. He wrote, he said, "Do you know, I have come back to Swedenborg after vast studies of all religions, and after reading all the works published within the last 60 years. Swedenborg undoubtedly epitomized all human religions, or rather the one religion." So that was de Balzac. Another one impacted a very famous writer, Dostoevsky, was influenced by Swedenborg in his book Crime and Punishment. And there's views of Swedenborg's view of heaven, hell, and the evil spirits working in your voice and angelic spirits. Goethe once said that it was only after reading Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell that he was enabled to write his masterpiece, Faustus. Charles Baudelaire, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, was one of the most famous and controversial French poets of the modern age. He wrote the poem, The Flowers of Evil, and was fascinated and incorporated Swedenborg's study of correspondences. The artist George Inness is the father of the American landscape painting, was influenced by Swedenborg's correspondence, and he went so far as to get baptized in the Brooklyn Swedenborgian Church. Sculptor Hiram Powers was one of the first 19th century American artists to gain an international reputation for his marble sculpture. That picture there is of his most famous sculpture called The Greek Slave. He said of Swedenborg, "Swedenborg is my author. All their writers seem moving in the dark with tapered hands, groping their way. He moves in broad daylight of the sun." In the area of poetry and novels was the famous poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She was one of the most famous female writers of her day, internationally recognized for her innovative, challenging verse. She said of Swedenborg, "To my mind, the only light that has been cast on the other life is found in Swedenborg's philosophy. It explains much that was incomprehensible." And another poet influenced was Robert Frost. He was raised Swedenborgian. And although he did not stay with the church, Swedenborg's writings about the physical world corresponding to the spiritual one can be seen in his poetry. And in his own words, he wrote, "I was brought up Swedenborgian. I'm not Swedenborgian now, but there's a good deal of it that's left with me. I'm a mystic. I believe in symbols." So you can see the impact among poets, sculptors, artists, authors, hugely impact in the literary world. Another area that Swedenborg impacted was the social reform movements of the 19th century. Again, I think because he was this sort of counterculture person that artists liked, they also were attracted to social justice movements. And in the Romantic and Transcendental movements, they were concerned about the impact of the industrial age on the poor. But one of the things that really sort of shocked people of the time and was very attractive to this counterculture was Swedenborg's unique embrace of the African race. And so his followers were some of the earliest abolitionists. One of his Swedenborg's quotes that got attention and circulated was in his book, The Last Judgment. He said, the African people are more capable of enlightenment than all other people on earth because they have such a character as to think interiority and thus to accept the truths and acknowledge them. So that was a radical statement of the time, and it led to people like, in this image here is Karl Bernard Wadstrom, who became really one of the first abolitionists. Wadstrom was a chemist, but he also he wrote a book called The Observations on the Slave Trade in 1789, and he helped fuel the British anti-slavery movement. And Lydia Maria Child, also a famous anti-slavery activist, took her guidance from Swedenborg. Here in the Washington area, I'm fond to point out that Lord Fairfax of Fairfax County, long before the American Revolution, read Swedenborg and he freed his slaves. And one of his ancestors, with his name, a Black candidate for lieutenant governor, was our recent lieutenant governor of Virginia, was an ancestor of that freedom. And prominent in the DC church, the Washington DC church, were military leaders from the Civil War who had led African-American troops in battle, and they helped create a African-American church here in Washington, DC, and created the first ever preschool for Black children. And I preached a whole sermon on that, which you can check out. We can get a link if you're interested. His reformist impact was also among industrialists at the time. Robert Owen was a famous textile industrialist in Scotland and looked to Swedenborg's writing to guide him to look for proper ways to treat workers. And it led to a disenchantment with capitalism as it was being conducted in England at that time. So there was also interest in, I'd mentioned, utopian societies, people building communities. Brook Farm is an example of a utopian community that had Swedenborgian influence. Probably the most famous civil rights, human rights activist who was inspired by Swedenborg is Helen Keller, and she's probably the most famous. A blind and deaf woman inspired by Swedenborg. She wrote, for the first time, immortality put to me in an intelligible way. The earth wore new curves of loveliness and significance. And so she actually wrote a book called My Religion, which today has also been republished as Light in My Darkness. And she refers to Swedenborg as her inspiration, one of the noblest true Christianity has ever known. She adds that the truths contained in Swedenborg's writing have been to me facilities what light, color, and music are to the eye and the ear. So she actually believed that in a way her disability gave her a spiritual superpower to see things more clearly spiritually, and felt Swedenborg had nailed it with his writings. Another movement that was impacted by Swedenborg was something called spiritualism. This is a mid-19th century movement that people began speaking with the dead, so seances. And they looked to Swedenborg's line from his book, Secrets of Heaven, where he said, "The Lord in his divine mercy granted me the opportunity for several years without break or interruption to keep company with spirits and angels, to hear them talking and to speak with them in turn." So this was used by the spiritualist community, and that was growing largely in in New England originally. Swedenborg in his writings warns against engaging with contact with the spiritual world. He said it was too easy for evil spirits to fool people, to get on the conference line and interrupt. And But I will say also, so I will say that Swedenborgians frowned upon spiritualism. So the Swedenborgian movement, which we'll talk about next week, I think the churches generally were embarrassed by the spiritualism movement that was taking off. One of the reasons probably for the rise in spiritualism in the late 1800s was also that so many people had lost people to the Civil War. You might remember that Mary Todd Lincoln had seances in the White House and evidently was also a reader of Swedenborg. So the spiritualists would actually have meetings, seances, and try to connect with the dead, and they looked, to Swedenborg for inspiration for that. One of the most famous spirituals was actually in England, and he is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He is the author of Sherlock Holmes stories. You're all familiar with him, but he also wrote a book called The History of Spiritualism. And he wrote, every spiritualist should honor Swedenborg, and his bust should be in every spiritualist temple as being the first and greatest of modern mediums. So again, while the Swedenborgian church was saying, you shouldn't be talking to the other side, the spiritualist movement was invoking him. In the United States, before even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a gentleman named Andrew Jackson Davis got a lot of attention and is considered, I would say, the father of American spiritualism. And he actually claimed that the spirit of Emanuel Swedenborg had visited him in a trance and given him the power of healing. And he wrote several books about this. And the books, many said, well, these are just kind of rewriting a lot of Swedenborg's writings. But he said he received all these clairvoyantly. Davis became enormously popular in the spiritualist movement. And that really kind of created a bond for many people to this day of Swedenborg and spiritualism. They're different, but that really bonded it. So the spiritualist movement had a key principle in it. What happens above happens below, and what we control in our mind, we can control in our body. So manifesting, which you've heard of, and the book The Secret, are ancestors of this kind of moment where you can control your destiny by what you think. Even Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking would have been impacted by this. And so the connection of the mind, the body, what we can control. And in fact, it was Warren Felt Evans, a Swedenborgian minister, who wrote a message called Messenger of the New Age. And it was about Swedenborg. And so the phrase, the New Age, is actually taken from that title. So again, Swedenborgians today would not necessarily connect with a lot of what is called the New Age, but that phrase, New Age, actually comes from a Swedenborg minister's translation. And the New Age evolved into different things. Two areas, one, money, and the other, health. The gospel of wealth and the idea that you could be rich, you could think and grow rich, it was all in your mind. Napoleon Hill's book. This comes out of Swedenborg's teachings, but it's not really what Swedenborg taught, but this came out of it, the idea that our mind has impact on things. It also had an impact on health. People started connecting, you can control your health through your spiritual energy. And Swedenborg did at times speak to that there were, if you engaged evil spirits, your physical health would deteriorate. Mary Baker Eddy, who created one of the most enduring spiritual movements in the United States, interesting also as a female leader, was influenced by Swedenborg and derives a lot of that insight from that idea that we can control things through our thoughts, and that illness is a product of not being connected with the body and the soul. In that same genre of medicine came homeopathy, and the Englishman James John Gareth Wilkinson was a homeopathic physician, and he also was a Swedenborg writer, and he made a connection between Swedenborg's theology and homeopathy, and the idea that you can use small aspects of a disease, taken in small amounts, to build up your own immunity to it. and it predates antibiotics and so forth. So it was quite popular, and it's kind of having a renewed popularity today, people getting turned off by prescription drugs, but it did fall out of favor. But there was a strong connection between Swedenborgian philosophy and homeopathic medicine. The first homeopathic pharmacy in the United States was in Philadelphia, created by, you'll recognize these names maybe, Bjerke and Toffel, and they offered Swedenborgian tracts as part of it. And in that image right there, that's Bjerke and Toffel, but on the right, you can see today that product still exists. You can see Bjerke and Toffel if you go to Whole Foods and you look in the homeopathic section, you can see that it still exists today. But there was at one point a whole string of Bjerke and Toffel homeopathic pharmaceuticals that also had Swedenborg's writings in the place. So it had an impact on health. It also had an impact on the mind in the area of psychology. Maybe one of the most famous therapists of all times and psychologists is Carl Jung, and he read Swedenborg. And he wrote in one place, "I am in love. I love searching and yearning," that Swedenborg so wonderfully describes. Another place he said, "I admire Swedenborg as a great scientist and a great mystic at the same time. His life and work always interested me. And I've read his 7 fat volumes of his writing when I was a medical student." So Carl Jung and his archetypes are very similar to correspondences that Swedenborg talked about, images. So other famous Swedenborgians, we know the ones we know, the most famous ones we know are because Hollywood made a movie of them. I think we know Helen Keller probably because of the play and the movie, The Miracle Worker. And so that made her famous for generations. But Disney also made another Swedenborgian famous, but nobody seems to know that he's a Swedenborgian. And that's a guy named John Chapman, who you probably never heard of. But you did, if you look at the image there, John Chapman is Johnny Appleseed. And he became a cartoon for Disney. He became an American folk hero. He lived with the Indians and he planted groves and groves of trees throughout the Midwest. Had basically a spiritual entrepreneur business because he made money from the sale of products and then kept moving and grew more products. He's one of the first environmentalists. But he was a missionary for Swedenborg, and on his travels through Ohio and Indiana, he would give out tracts of Swedenborg's teachings to people. And his phrase that he used was, "I've got good news right fresh from heaven." And that's how he would refer to Swedenborg's writings. So very interesting character and a famous person in American history. And thanks to Disney, people know about Johnny Appleseed. In the area of architecture, Daniel Burnham is a famous architect in DC. He designed Union Station. But he was also director of the 1893 World Fair in Chicago. And it said that he drew the city of Chicago. He was the architect of the city of Chicago based on Swedenborg's vision of the Holy City. That exposition was also home to the first World Parliament of Religions, and that was also created by a Swedenborgian, Charles Carroll Bonney. Created it, and it marked the first time that Eastern religions had come into the United States. I just learned recently from our president, Jim Lawrence, that Hinduism, Swami, I can't pronounce his last name, but I'll give it a shot, Vivekananda, somebody who knows Hinduism can pronounce it properly, who was a key figure in Hindu philosophy and yoga and so forth, came to the United States through that parliament. And I just learned that he stayed with a Swedenborgian minister who hosted him and the Hindus in Ohio, and it was my great-grandfather at Urbana College. Okay, so politics. This is a kind of a long distance connection, but I found this kind of interesting. George Bush is there's Bonnie, and look at those two pictures. There's Bonnie there, and the next picture that's George H.W. Bush, and George Bush on the right was a Swedenborgian scholar, a biblical scholar, an abolitionist, and minister of the Swedenborg Church of New York. So I just rescued his portrait from that. It's now sitting in our church here. And so he was a famous Swedenborgian Presbyterian, I believe, who became Swedenborgian. in New York, and wasn't that involved in politics, but look at the resemblance between these two Bushes. So the Bush family, yes, he's related to the Bush family that would go on to become presidents. Another interesting little political connection is a gentleman named Arthur Sewell. You probably never heard of. He was a shipbuilder from Maine, but he was the Democratic nominee. There's a picture of him when he was running with William Jennings Bryan in 1896. His brother, Frank Sewell, was the first pastor of Church of the Holy City, who designed Church of the Holy City. And many people in their notes that I found said they were excited to build the church, thinking it would be the church for the new president and the vice president in 1896 when they put in the cornerstone. They didn't win, but had they won, maybe that would be true. But I thought that's a little interesting tidbit. So Swedenborg is so connected to so many things that when I travel now and I'm speaking, I kind of look it up. I was in Michigan for a while working in Detroit and found out that Swedenborg was so well known and popular that they considered his name for Lansing, the capital of Michigan. And Ann Arbor, Michigan, for example, was created by Swedenborgians. So it's just like everywhere you go, there's like this little Swedenborgian influence in American history. Andrew Carnegie, who is a Scottish-American industrialist and philanthropist, very famous. We all know the Carnegie libraries that still exist today. But he kind of defined philanthropy. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth. He argued for progressive taxation and the estate tax and philanthropy. He noted in his writings that he was touched by Swedenborg's writing. As a youth, he was a member of the Swedenborgian community in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, that later would become the Pittsburgh Society. And after he made all of his money, he donated a number of organs to Swedenborgian churches later in his life. So Swedenborg has this huge impact. You've seen it. And so what about today? Well, even today, Swedenborg is having an impact. Just most recently, I think it was last year, the movie Things Heard and Seen on Netflix, which you can catch. There's a picture of the actress star reading Heaven and Hell. It's a spooky murder mystery sort of horror, and it plays in the Swedenborgian seance thing, because the guy in the movie says, we're Swedenborgians and we can talk to the dead. But it's all focused around Swedenborg's writings, and that Things Heard and Seen is a quote from Swedenborg that he used for his writings. So you can say that Swedenborg has had a huge impact in many ways we do not know. Helen Keller kind of sums up Swedenborg's impact in this way, and I put the quote in there. Many years have passed since Swedenborg's death, and slowly his achievements have been gaining recognition. Many intelligent people have advocated his teachings at the centers of civilization and carried them to nooks and corners of the world undreamed of by most of us. His message has traveled like light side by side with new science and the new society, which were struggling to realize themselves in the life of humanity. So that is a good summary of Swedenborg's impact from Helen Keller. And I can now open it up to any questions or comments about Swedenborg's impact from anybody.